Refrain, written by Langue de Chat, read by Rashi. Amidst the battlefield, a frenzied bolt of dark magic flared from an enemy mage, striking Hubert square in the chest. Bernadette shrieked as he fell. Ferdinand disabled the attacker by forcing a lance through her body in one clean motion. As Ferdinand yanked the point out of her, deep red splattered from it, gushing onto the ground from the yawning wound. She fell, clutching her abdomen. Ferdinand thrust a thin, long dagger through her eye to end her pain. He pulled out the dagger when she was no longer moving. The battlefield grew sparse from a successful campaign as the day passed, but Ferdinand remained alert, surveying their surroundings for any more threats from their enemy.
"Ferdinand!"
Bernadette squeaked.
He's not breathing, and his heart's not—
"Bring a healer!" Ferdinand called, throwing away his dagger and marching towards Hubert. He unbuttoned the jacket of his uniform, tossing it to one side. "I'll stay with him." He positioned Hubert so he was laid on his back. Ferdinand knelt next to him, placing the heel of his hand on Hubert's chest, aligning it with his sternum. Interlocking his fingers with each other, he adjusted the position of his hands once more before pressing down on his chest with all of his weight. He continued the chest compressions at the rhythm he was taught, to the beat of one of Manuela's best arias, humming it under his breath. He paused his compressions after the first few lines to tilt Hubert's head upwards, pinching his nose and sealing his lips with Ferdinand's own to force his breath into Hubert's lungs. Ferdinand rested one of his hands on Hubert's chest to feel for it rising as air entered his chest. After repeating the kiss of life once more, Ferdinand resumed the compressions, feeling Hubert's ribs resist him with each push. After finishing the stanza, he pressed his lips to Hubert's once more. When he pushed against Hubert's breastbone in the next set, he felt his ribs creak until a snap reverberated through Hubert's chest and up his arms. For a beat, Ferdinand froze in horror, his hands covering over Hubert's motionless body. When he snapped back into reality, he continued, alternating between the compressions, the breaths, and compressions again, all to the beat of the same song. He did not stop until he heard his name being called once more.
"Ferdinand!"
Dorothea said out of breath. He glanced over to her, with his mouth still on Hubert's, seeing a crackling white-blue glow from her fingertips. When Ferdinand returned to press on Hubert's chest again, she spoke. "Ready when you are." After one more press of Hubert's chest, he flung himself away, and Dorothea grasped at Hubert's neck. Blinding sparks burst from her palms. Hubert's body jolted, and did so again when Dorothea administered another set of sparks on him. On the third, Hubert's eyes shot open, and his chest rose, and he took a groaning breath. Dorothea gave Ferdinand a smile, whose gaze was on her patient, laid on the ground. Hubert turned his head and let out another groan.
"What?"
"You were going to be gone for good, Hubie," Dorothea said softly, before turning to Ferdinand. "Thank you, Ferdy." Ferdinand nodded, drawing closer to Hubert, who began to rouse. Hubert let out a strained noise of agony, clutching just beneath his chest. Ferdinand spoke without thinking. "I think I broke your ribs. My apologies." "How the fuck did you manage that?" Hubert spat. "Hubie!" Dorothea snapped. "Don't talk or move." A softer light glowed from Dorothea's hands as she rested them on Hubert's chest, to which he let out another pained moan. He was shushed once more by Dorothea, and Ferdinand let out a deep breath. He watched Hubert squint and grumble as he complained, while the memory of Hubert's very still body still lingered in his mind. He snapped out of his daze when Dorothea stood up, putting her hands together, as if she was dusting them off. "There, all done." Hubert's expression was contorted into a grimace, still seated on the ground. Ferdinand stood up first, offering his hand to Hubert, who stared at it for a moment before reaching up to grasp it. As he was hoisted up, Hubert stumbled, and Ferdinand brought his other hand to Hubert's arm, steadying him. "Easy," Ferdinand murmured. When Hubert was able to stand on his own 2 feet, he pulled his hand away from Ferdinand's and cleared his throat. "Thank you for your help," Hubert said to Dorothea.
Dorothea smiled. "I'm just glad that you're fine now. And besides that, Ferdy helped too."
"By breaking my ribs?" Hubert quipped.
"Through chest compressions."
Dorothea put her hands on her hips, frowning.
"He kept your soul intact by keeping your heart beating until I arrived."
Hubert blinked. "And so I was that far gone?"
"Mm-hmm,"
Dorothea hummed. Hubert turned to Ferdinand. "Then you have my sincere thanks. My apologies for my outburst," he said softly. At his words, Ferdinand felt another wave of calmness envelop him.
"I am glad that you are alive,"
Ferdinand said, smiling at him. "As am I," Hubert said with a wry grin. Welcoming Hubert out of unconsciousness was a fuzzy visage of the tented ceiling of their medical bay. A voice called for him softly. He turned his head to the source of it, and the hazy silhouette grew somewhat more distinct with each blink, until he saw a head of long ginger hair. Ferdinand's hair was bedraggled and untamed, as opposed to his usual flowing locks, and his armor was marred with dirt and splattered with blood from battle. Hubert's memories returned to him, making him freeze. He was knocked to the ground while in battle, winding him. Beyond that, darkness, agony, until he had only just stirred. Ferdinand's gauntlets and gloves underneath were removed, revealing a pair of hands, dirtied by the color of rust that seeped into the creases of his hands and the crevices of his fingernails. Ferdinand gave him an exhausted smile, tinged with sorrow, as he perched on the wooden stool next to Hubert's bed. "The battle?" Hubert asked, without delay. "All finished," was all that Ferdinand said. Hubert waited, expecting more to follow. "And?" he said, when nothing came. "And what?" Ferdinand echoed. The palpable gloominess in Ferdinand's expression perturbed Hubert. "Did it go well? Lady Edelgard, her teacher, everyone else, are they well?" "Yes, and yes. Any other losses or casualties?" Hubert pressed. "None," Ferdinand said. A wave of surprise, then relief, washed over Hubert. "Oh." As the feeling settled, Hubert hoisted himself up so he could sit in bed. A sharp pain tore through the left side of his body, making him wince as a pained hiss escaped him. Ferdinand moved closer to him, putting his hand by Hubert's arm. "Easy, Hubert. Dorothea told me that you should remain comfortable in bed." When Hubert looked at the left side of his body, a large section of it was covered in clean wrappings, the color of fresh cream. Hubert watched Ferdinand, with blood still on his hands, and his demeanor lacking its usual sparkle. "How are you feeling, Hubert?" he asked. From the bandages, the pain from one localized area, and the slight lightheadedness he felt, he could only assume that someone had got him with something sharp and dangerous. "I'm fine now," Hubert said. "And you?" Ferdinand's shoulders sank. "Great! I am fine as well." As he was in 2 minds on whether to pry further, Ferdinand stared at the floor of the tent, forlorn. It hastened Hubert to a resolution. "You do not seem fine." Ferdinand responded with an uneven chuckle. Well, Hubert began, hesitant. "I am not one for comforting others, but I am willing to listen, if that would put you at ease." Ferdinand looked away. "It is rather stupid." "There are many matters that could be considered stupid, but are in actuality very worth listening to," Hubert remarked. He bit his tongue, mortified, No, forget that I said that. Forgive me. What I mean to say is that it cannot be stupid if it is troubling you."
Ferdinand grinned, with a little more warmth. His hands rested on his lap, tensing as he spoke.
"I had to hold your shoulder together, as Petra called for a mage." "Hold together?" "There was a gash, as if they had tried to split you in two, all the way down to the bone. I held you together to minimalize the blood loss."
Hubert swallowed, looking down at Ferdinand's fingers, where traces of blood remained.
"I see. Thank you."
Ferdinand nodded.
"I wonder if you recall. You were lying in a pool of your own blood, as I was above you, holding you together. You were calling for me, over and over, barely able to speak." "I do not, no. My apologies for the trouble,"
Hubert murmured, cringing at the ordeal as described, conjuring up a gruesome and pathetic image of himself in his mind. Ferdinand remained silent, staring down at his lap.
"There was a moment where I thought you would be gone. Forever."
"My apologies," Hubert said once more.
"It is certainly not the first time. Back when we were classmates, you were struck in the chest with magic. You fell down. You had no pulse."
All Hubert could remember of that time was an intense, brutal pain in his ribs.
"I think I recall. Back then, my only priority was keeping you well enough for the healers to revive you. It was my first time in that situation, so close to death. I was overtaken by a sense of duty."
Hubert nodded, watching Ferdinand, who was yet to meet his eyes.
"Today was different. I was so afraid of losing you."
Hubert blinked, flabbergasted.
"I did not know what I would do if I had lost you,"
he whispered, his voice cracking towards the end of his sentence. For a moment, Hubert's mouth was agape, and in the next, Ferdinand rose to his feet, looking away.
"My apologies. I ought to excuse myself."
Hubert moved without thinking, ignoring the pain from his shoulder to reach for Ferdinand's hand, holding it gently. Hubert swallowed, trying to make sense of the situation, looking up at a misty-eyed Ferdinand. Hubert struggled to find the right words to say. Ferdinand tried to pull his hand away, but Hubert held on to it.
"I am being over-emotional,"
Ferdinand said. When he blinked, tears rolled down his cheeks.
"I am fine. Really."
"You do not seem it," Hubert murmured, squeezing Ferdinand's hand. "And it does not bother me if you are over-emotional. Stay here." With a sniff, Ferdinand lowered himself back onto his stool, still holding Hubert's hand. Hubert adjusted himself to pry his fingers in between Ferdinand's, lacing them together, hoping to comfort him. "I am sorry for worrying you." Ferdinand wiped his tears away with his other hand, still sniffling.
"I am being rather pathetic."
"I do not share that opinion. I am rather touched that you care," Hubert murmured.
"Of course I do, Hubert. I—"
Ferdinand trailed off, staring at their hands. Hubert said, stroking Ferdinand's hand with his thumb, as if encouraging him to continue. After a few moments of silence, Hubert's eyes troubled up Ferdinand's arm. "Perhaps you would feel a little better without all that heavy armor on you." Ferdinand pulled his hand away from Hubert's to unfasten his vambrance.
"Oh!"
Hubert smiled. "Turn around, and I can help you." Ferdinand shuffled his feet around the stool, turning his back to Hubert, who combed Ferdinand's hair from his back, gently brushing it to his shoulder. so he could unfasten the clasps at the back of his cuirass. He continued to loosen other fastenings at Ferdinand's back and shoulders, helping him shed the rest of it. When Ferdinand was detaching his greaves down on his shin, Hubert gathered Ferdinand's hair onto his back again, over his padded doublet now that his armor was removed. Without thinking, Hubert began to comb his fingers into Ferdinand's copper locks to detangle them. He marveled at how long Ferdinand had let it grow. On occasion, Ferdinand would ask for Hubert's help with it, knowing that he had experience with tending to long hair. Hubert was more than happy to assist. Each time Ferdinand would complain about it, saying that he ought to cut it soon, and each time Hubert would hope that he would not, knowing how well he suited it. "Did you need help with this?" Hubert asked, running his fingers through Ferdinand's hair. Ferdinand remained still. "It needs a wash. Perhaps afterwards." Hubert hoped that he did not sound too keen. Ferdinand nodded. When his armor was placed neatly on the ground, he turned to face Hubert again. His eyes lingered on Hubert's hand, resting on the blanket. After a moment of silence, Ferdinand spoke, cautious and hesitant. "Would I be able to hold your hand again?" he asked. Hubert grinned, offering his hand to Ferdinand, and Ferdinand brought both of his hands around Hubert's, cradling it. Ferdinand's thumbs caressed the back of his hand, and laughter threatened to bubble up Hubert's chest. Why would someone like Ferdinand be seeking comfort from someone like him? He dare not ask, not wanting Ferdinand to stop holding his hand, as if it was something precious. Hubert watched him, illuminated by golden lamplight. Ferdinand remained focused on their hands, and Hubert's eyes trailed down his face, from the bridge of his nose down to the tip, glancing at the faint freckles that constellated across his nose and cheeks, down to his lips. His hair fell in lank strands, and Hubert wanted to brush them away from his face. Inexplicably, his pulse raced. Hubert continued to observe him, hoping that Ferdinand would notice being stared at, all while Ferdinand enveloped Hubert's hands with his. He wanted Ferdinand to look at him with that same honeyed gaze that was cast down onto his hand. With one hand, Ferdinand slowly lifted Hubert's hand, and Hubert let him, curious, all while keeping his gaze affixed on Ferdinand's, who was yet to meet his own. Ferdinand pressed his lips to Hubert's hand, on the space between his fingers and knuckles. Hubert took in a sharp breath when Ferdinand's honey-colored eyes met Hubert's. He stared back at him, with his mouth hung open. Ferdinand flung his hands away and stood up. "My apologies," he said, brushing his hands against his clothes, smoothing out the fabric. I'm very sorry. I don't know what came over me." Hubert's face burned. The thumping in his chest worsened, and he could not bring himself to say a single word. "I'm certainly not thinking properly. It has been a long day for me." Ferdinand spoke quickly, his cheeks pink. "I'm certain you've had enough of me. I should probably get myself clean." He hurried to collect his gear, avoiding Hubert's gaze. "If you'll excuse me. Good night. Rest well." Hubert cleared his throat. "See me later?" Ferdinand froze. "Tonight?" he asked, hesitant. Hubert nodded. "I was going to, help you with your hair." "Oh, yes, you were. Certainly, I can do." Ferdinand said, still clutching his armor. Then, in that case, I shall see you in a bit." With another nod from Hubert, Ferdinand hurried out of the tent, the flap closing behind him, to leave Hubert all alone. He stared at the spot where Ferdinand kissed his hand. It was the first time that anyone had kissed his hand, and he was curious if Ferdinand could assume so. He brought his hand to his mouth, grazing the space where his fingers met his knuckles against his lips, speculating if Ferdinand did it often, and wondering how many hands Ferdinand had kissed before his. He wondered if he could ever muster up the courage to ask. His heart raced, his thoughts still revolving around the kiss, as he looked forward to seeing Ferdinand again that evening.